A single footprint in the mud of New Mexico is 23,000 years old. The weight of that sentence doesn't hit you immediately. It feels like a dry archaeological statistic until you realize that 23,000 years ago, the world was a frozen fortress. Massive ice sheets, miles thick, choked the northern hemisphere, effectively sealing off the Americas from the rest of the world. Or so we thought. You can almost smell the sharp metallic scent of the glacial air and hear the crunch of dry grass under the weight of a mammoth. In that landscape, a teenager stood by the edge of a long dead lake, their weight pressing into the soft earth, leaving a mark that would wait in the dark for 23 millennia to tell us we were wrong about everything. This is not a story of maps and borders, because for 99% of our history, those things didn't exist. It is a story of how a small, vulnerable primate with no claws, no fur, and no innate sense of direction managed to claim every corner of a planet that seemed designed to kill it. We are the only large animal to inhabit every continent, and we didn't do it by being the strongest. We did it by being the most restless. To understand how we moved, you have to feel the ground as it was 2 million years ago. Imagine a creature that is not quite you, but recognizable, a cousin named Homo erectus. Picture them standing in the tall golden grass of the East African Rift Valley. The sun is a physical weight on their shoulders, and the air is thick with the scent of dust and dung. This ancestor had something no one before them possessed, a body built specifically for the long haul. Their legs were long, their feet had arches, and crucially, they could sweat. This allowed them to move when every other predator had to hide from the heat. And so they walked. They didn't walk because they had a destination. They walked because the horizon was there. We see the evidence of this ancient wanderlust at a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia. There, tucked between the Black and Caspian Seas, a region that probably felt like the edge of the world to them, archaeologists found 5 skulls. They are 1.8 million years old. These individuals had small brains and stone tools that were little more than sharpened pebbles, yet they had already traveled thousands of miles from the cradle of their birth. They were pioneers in a world that had no names for its mountains, moving through a landscape of giant hyenas and saber-toothed cats, driven by a biological imperative to see what was over the next ridge. The journey of our own direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, began much later, but with an even more dramatic push. Around 70,000 years ago, a tiny group of humans, perhaps no more than a few hundred or 1,000, crossed from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. This was a bottleneck, a moment where the entire future of the human race hung by a thread. If a single flash flood or a week of failed hunting had wiped them out, the rest of human history would simply never have happened. You can imagine the tension in that group, the sound of children crying in the dark, and the constant gnawing pressure of hunger. They were moving into a world that was already occupied. As they pushed into Europe and Asia, they encountered the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, other human species who had been living in these cold, harsh climates for hundreds of thousands of years. We know now, thanks to the groundbreaking work of geneticists like Svante Pääbo and David Reich, that we didn't just replace these people, we became them. We carried their DNA with us as we moved, a genetic souvenir of encounters that happened in caves and river valleys tens of thousands of years ago. These migrations were slow, agonizingly slow, perhaps only moving a few dozen miles every generation, but they were relentless. Then we hit the water. This is where the story shifts from a slow walk to an act of unbelievable daring. Between the ancient landmass of Sunda, which included much of modern Indonesia, and the continent of Sahul, which we now know as Australia and New Guinea, there was a gap. It wasn't a land bridge. It was deep, open ocean. Even when sea levels were at their lowest, there were at least 50 miles of churning, shark-filled water between the islands. To cross it, you had to lose sight of land. You had to look at a blue horizon that offered no promises and decide to go anyway. Think about the sensory reality of that moment. The smell of damp bamboo, the rough texture of handmade vine rope, and the terrifying realization that the ground you have trusted your entire life is gone. In 2017, a study published in the journal Nature, led by Chris Clarkson, revealed that humans were in northern Australia at the Majid Bibi rock shelter 65,000 years ago. To get there at that time, they had to be sailors. They built rafts. They watched the birds, and they followed the smell of smoke or the sight of clouds that gather over land. They weren't just migrants. They were explorers of the highest order, navigating by the stars and the rhythm of the swells before the concept of a map was even a whisper in the human mind. But as impressive as the Australian crossing was, it pales in comparison to the colonization of the remote Pacific. This was the final frontier, a world of water so vast it covers a third of the planet. To find a tiny speck of land like Hawaii or Easter Island in that blue void is a feat of mathematics and intuition that borders on the supernatural. The Polynesians, who, according to linguistic and archaeological evidence, began their push from Southeast Asia through the Lapita culture, developed a system called wayfinding. They didn't have compasses or sextants. They had the world. A navigator would sit in the hull of a double-hulled canoe and feel the ocean. They could distinguish between 5 or 6 different swell patterns hitting the boat at once, some reflecting off distant islands, some coming from storms thousands of miles away. They used a star compass, a mental map of where every major star rose and set on the horizon. If you've ever been on the ocean at night with no city lights to dim the sky, you know the overwhelming, terrifying density of the stars. To these navigators, that sky was a library. They reached New Zealand, the last major landmass to be settled, only about 800 years ago. While the Middle Ages were in full swing in Europe, Polynesian voyagers were still discovering entirely new worlds. Their sails made of woven pandanus leaves catching winds that had never been harnessed by humans before. The movement into the Americas remains perhaps the most debated and mysterious chapter of this entire saga. For decades, the Clovis first theory dominated textbooks, suggesting that humans walked across a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska about 13,000 years ago, following an ice-free corridor between massive glaciers. But that story, which, like many neat historical narratives, turned out to be far too simple, began to crumble under the weight of new evidence. At Monteverde in Chile, researchers found evidence of human life from 14,500 years ago. If they were that far south by then, they must have arrived much earlier. This gave rise to the Kelp Highway hypothesis, the idea that ancient humans didn't just walk, they paddled. They followed the coastlines in small boats, living off the incredibly rich ecosystems of the kelp forest that fringed the Pacific Rim. This would have allowed them to bypass the ice sheets entirely. And then came the White Sands footprints. These tracks, found in New Mexico and dated by researchers like Matthew Bennett and Kim Bustos, suggest humans were in the heart of North America 23,000 years ago. It means people were here during the height of the last glacial maximum, living in a world we thought was inaccessible. It forces us to imagine a group of humans who were so adaptable, so determined, that they found a way through or around a wall of ice 2 miles high. The science behind these travels is becoming increasingly high resolution. We can now use paleoclimate reconstruction to see exactly what the weather was like on a specific Tuesday 50,000 years ago. We can see that the green Sahara periods, times when the desert was a lush landscape of lakes and rivers, acted like a series of pumps, drawing humans out of East Africa and then pushing them further as the rains failed. We can track the specific mutations in our mitochondrial DNA to see the exact path a mother's lineage took from the steppes of Central Asia to the coast of Greenland. We even see it in our parasites. The evolution of bedbugs and lice mirrors the movement of humans into new climates and the adoption of clothing. Every piece of data points to the same conclusion. We are a species of the move or die variety. Our very biology, the way our brains process spatial information, the way our metabolism handles different types of food, is a record of a million-mile journey. We evolved to be on the move, and the moment we stopped, we had to invent agriculture and cities just to cope with the sudden lack of a horizon. But even as the data gets better, the why remains elusive. Why didn't we just stay in the lush valleys of Africa? Why did that first person in a raft decide to push off into a sea they couldn't see across? There is a specific gene, the DRD4-7R variant, often called the wanderlust gene, that is linked to dopamine levels and a desire for novelty. Interestingly, research has shown that this gene is much more common in populations that migrated long distances from Africa than in those who stayed closer to home. It's as if we were self-selecting for restlessness. Every time a group reached a mountain range, the people who were content to stay in the valley remained, and the people who couldn't sleep until they saw the other side moved on. Over thousands of generations, this filtered for a specific type of mind, a mind that views a barrier not as a stopping point, but as a challenge. We are the descendants of the people who didn't stay behind. We are the children of the bored, the curious, and the desperate. This constant movement changed us physically. As we moved into northern latitudes with less sunlight, our skin lightened to allow for the synthesis of vitamin D. As we moved into high-altitude regions like the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau, our lungs and blood evolved to carry more oxygen. As we moved into regions with domesticated cattle, some of us developed the ability to digest milk as adults, a trait that occurred independently in Europe and Africa. These aren't just biological facts, they are the scars of our travels. Every physical trait we possess is a solution to a problem encountered on the road. We didn't just travel the world. The world traveled through us, shaping our bones and our blood to fit its various niches. Our history is written in the landscape, but it's also written in our very cells, a biological map of every mountain crossed and every ocean sailed. Think about the silence of a world with only a few thousand people in it. When those first humans arrived in the Americas or Australia, they were entering a virgin landscape, a place where the animals had no fear of humans because they had never seen a two-legged predator before. It must have felt like stepping onto another planet. The scale of the megafauna they encountered, the giant ground sloths the size of elephants, the wombats as big as cars, the eagles with 6-foot wingspans, is something we can only imagine. But we also know that our arrival was often a death sentence for these creatures. The overkill hypothesis suggests that as humans moved into new territories, we acted like a biological wildfire, consuming the slow-moving giants who had never learned to run from us. Our journey wasn't just one of discovery, it was one of transformation. We changed every ecosystem we touched, long before the first factory was ever built. We moved, we ate, we survived, and the world was never the same again. The technology of these travels was often incredibly simple, but perfectly adapted. Consider the sewn boat of the ancient Indian Ocean voyagers. Instead of using nails, which would rust and snap in the salt water, they used coconut fiber to literally sew the planks of their ships together. This made the hulls flexible, allowing them to bend and flex with the massive waves of the monsoon season rather than breaking. Or consider the Inuit of the Arctic, who developed the most sophisticated cold weather gear in human history using only animal skins and bone needles. Their clothing was designed to create a microclimate of trapped air around the body, allowing them to survive in temperatures that would kill a modern person in minutes. This wasn't primitive technology, it was high-performance engineering using the only materials available. They were solving complex thermodynamic and fluid dynamic problems using nothing but intuition and thousands of years of trial and error. And what about the individual? We talk about migrations and populations as if they were monolithic waves, but they were made of people. There was a first person to taste a new kind of fruit in a new land. There was a mother who had to decide if her newborn could survive another week of walking through the snow. There was a navigator who stared at the stars and realized they had moved, and that they were now in a place where the old rules didn't apply. These people didn't know they were populating the globe. They didn't know they were part of a grand historical narrative. They were just trying to find a better hunting ground, or escaping a drought, or following a dream. Their courage was quiet, constant, and totally unrecorded. Until now, when we pull their DNA from a cave floor or find their charcoal in a long-dead hearth. We should also consider the linguistic evidence of these travels. Linguists can track the movement of people by the way languages branch and evolve, much like a genetic tree. We can see the Bantu expansion across Africa as a single group of farmers and iron workers moved south and east, carrying their language family with them and displacing or absorbing older hunter-gatherer groups. We can see the Indo-European expansion that spread a single root language from the steppes of Eurasia all the way to the shores of Ireland and the plains of India. These weren't just movements of people, but of ideas, stories, and ways of seeing the world. When you speak English or Spanish or Hindi, you are using the tools of a specific migration that happened thousands of years ago. Your very thoughts are structured by the choices of a few thousand wanderers who decided to move. The sheer scale of human travel before the modern era is often underestimated. We have evidence of trade networks that spanned continents long before the Silk Road. Obsidian from a single volcano in the Mediterranean has been found in archaeological sites hundreds of miles away. Shells from the Indian Ocean have been found in the graves of Neolithic farmers in the heart of Europe. We were never isolated. Even as we spread out and formed distinct cultures and languages, we remained connected by a web of exchange. We moved because we were curious, but we also moved because we wanted what the person over the hill had. This drive for stuff, for rare stones, for better furs, for exotic spices, was as much a driver of our expansion as the search for food. We have always been a species of traders, and every trade required a journey. Looking back at that 23,000-year-old footprint in New Mexico, you begin to see it differently. It's not just a mark in the mud, it's a signature. It's a statement of presence in a place that should have been empty. It represents a journey that began 2 million years earlier in a sun-drenched valley in Africa and ended, for that moment, on the shore of a glacial lake in the American Southwest. It is the culmination of trillions of individual steps, millions of nights spent under strange stars, and an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back to the dawn of our genus. Every one of us is here because our ancestors refused to be stopped by oceans or mountains or walls of ice. We are the survivors of a 2 million-year-long trek, and that restlessness is still in us. We see it in our drive to explore the deep ocean, and we see it in our plans to set foot on Mars. We are a species that cannot sit still. This entire saga, from the first awkward steps of Homo erectus to the sophisticated wayfinding of the Polynesians, reveals a fundamental truth about what it means to be human. We are not defined by where we are, but by the fact that we are always going somewhere else. Our history is a map of our departures. We left the trees, we left the savanna, we left the continent of our birth, and eventually we left the very ground itself to fly. We are a biological anomaly, a creature that thrives on the unknown. And as we look at the challenges facing us today, perhaps there is some comfort in that. We come from a long line of people who solved the impossible. We come from people who looked at 1,000 miles of empty water and thought, I can cross that. That spirit of the wanderer, that wanderlust gene, is the reason you are alive to hear this story. It is the most powerful force in our history, and it is the reason we will never truly be finished. The story of human travel is ultimately a story of the human heart. It's about the fear of staying put and the hope of what lies beyond. We can analyze the bones, we can sequence the DNA, and we can model the ancient climates with perfect precision. We can explain the how until the end of time. We can talk about stone tools and sewn boats and the kelp highway until the facts are exhausted. But the why, the actual internal spark that made that first human push-off from the shore, that remains the most beautiful mystery of all. It is a spark that exists in you right now every time you look at the horizon and feel a slight, inexplicable pull. That pull is 23,000 years old. It is 2 million years old. It is the oldest thing about us. You are the end result of 1 million gambles that paid off. You are the descendant of the few who made it through the bottleneck, the ones who didn't drown in the Sahel crossing, the ones who didn't freeze in Beringia. Every single person in your lineage for 2 million years succeeded in the most difficult journey in the history of life on Earth. They walked, they paddled, they climbed, and they survived so that you could stand here today. They left everything behind so that you could have everything, and they did it all without knowing where they were going. They just knew that they couldn't stay where they were. That is the legacy of our species. That is our shared bloodlines. So the next time you feel restless, or the next time you feel like the world is too small, remember the teenager in New Mexico. Remember the navigator in the Pacific. Remember the mother in the African Rift. You carry their curiosity in your brain and their endurance in your muscles. You were built for the road. You were built for the horizon. And if history is any guide, we are only just getting started. The journey that began with a single footprint in the mud is still ongoing, and the next horizon is already calling. We have always been travelers, and we always will be, because for us, the destination has never been the point. The great migration of humanity is not a finished chapter in a dusty textbook, but a living, breathing reality that continues every single day. We see it in the global exchange of ideas, in the way our cultures blend and shift, and in our constant reach for the next frontier. We have never been a species that accepts limits. We didn't accept the limit of the savanna, we didn't accept the limit of the ocean, and we won't accept the limit of the sky. Our ancestors gave us the world, but more importantly, they gave us the hunger to see it all. They gave us the courage to be strangers in a strange land, and the wisdom to make that land our home. Which of these ancient crossings, the leap of faith into the Australian void or the frozen standstill of the Bering Land Bridge, strikes you as the most impossible? Let me know in the comments. Our history is a long line of people who walked into the dark and found the light. Somewhere, on a world we haven't even named yet, a human will one day leave a footprint in the dust and look back at a pale blue dot in the sky. And they will feel exactly what that teenager felt in the mud of New Mexico 23,000 years ago. They will feel the weight of the journey, the thrill of the unknown, and the deep, quiet knowledge that they are exactly where they were always meant to be, somewhere else. We didn't just travel to find a home, we traveled to prove that the entire universe belongs to us. The horizon has never been a boundary. It has only ever been an invitation.